Thank you. My name is Reuben Abraham. I'm with the Milken Institute, and I run a think tank in Bombay. The way we've structured this is we're going to have about 40 minutes of conversation between me and the panelists, and then we'll open it up to questions. If you have any pressing questions in between, throw up your hands. That's cool. But let's make this interactive. Let's have fun. It's early in the morning. We'll all fall asleep otherwise. So cool. OK. The news out of India in the last couple of months have not been great. So GDP growth has slowed down to 5.7%. And that's using the new methodology. If you'd used the old methodology, you'd actually have even lower numbers. Even more worryingly, if you look at CPI inflation numbers, they've been 1.5%, 2.3%, 3.3%. It's actually increasing even as growth is decreasing. So those numbers are worrying. But I know, Bunty, that you're a bit of an optimist on India. So why don't we start with you? Why don't you give us sort of, as Goldman, your sort of outside-in perspective on India? What's the view of the international financial community on India, and obviously yours as well?
Sure. Thanks, Reuben. And good morning, everyone. Look, I think that, first of all, the fact that I'm an optimist is a relatively newer avatar of mine, especially as it relates to India. But I would say a few things. First of all, keep this in context. In 15 years, the GDP, okay, from a small base, but the GDP of the country has grown, 5 times, right? I mean, it's like quite significant. There's been a few years of Goldilocks type environment, relatively low or controlled inflation, relatively narrow current account deficit, and then, obviously, relatively high GDP growth in real terms. And yeah, okay, the last several months, you have seen this slowdown. I think these aren't demand shocks, these are supply side reforms, having a near-term impact, demonetization, GST, and more to come, by the way. But in the long run, I mean, this is a country with thousands of years of recorded history. So, we shouldn't get too myopic. We could go on all day with like the dozens of different factors that might influence, the India trajectory, but I'll just talk about 5. And it's not that every one of these is an unqualified positive, but it feels like the win-to-loss ratio or the asymmetry is leaning towards positive on all these factors. So just very quickly, one, demographics. We talk about this all the time. It's a young country. Dependency ratios are coming down as people enter the workforce. And so you have that. As long as there's an ability to absorb that employment, I mean, you have a very, very strong economic growth tailwind. There's just no question about that. I would say the second is that there's an obvious productivity catch-up opportunity. You don't have to spend a lot of time in India to see some of the basic inefficiencies. Are we still good? Okay. But if you start to look at factors like, obviously, proliferation of technology, 650 million mobile phones. If you talk about primary education enrollment rates, there are things that are happening that are telling you that productivity gap may start to collapse. Now, look, there's still infrastructure shortfall that needs to be addressed. India is not very urban. I mean, even countries like Nigeria have significantly higher rates of urbanization, and so there's some efficiencies and ecosystem advantages that come with that. But agricultural productivity, 55% or so of India is dependent on agriculture. But these are, to me, these are opportunities. These aren't necessarily liabilities. Look, policy reform, I don't have to, I'm sure we'll touch on that many, many times, but there does seem to be motivated reform, and many of these things will create capital formation or transparency and formalization of the economy. Financialization of savings. India is a high savings rate country, 30-ish%, but most of that, 60% of that savings has historically been property gold, basically non-productive, non-multiplicative asset. And you're starting to see a shift, a greater financialization. So cash going from mattresses into bank accounts, cash in bank accounts going into savings instruments on the fixed income side becoming equities. I mean, just to put this in perspective, financial assets of a household in India, in terms of their savings, 4% of that is equities. Even extreme savers like China, 10%, the rest of Asia, 15%, the US, 40% almost. So this financialization has a long way to run. And then the last thing I'd say is digitization. And of course, there's a lot of romantic sort of hope around the idea of payment systems or transparency. But these are real efficiencies that get created. And they create a mindset change also in India where suddenly life is on the grid and not informal and unstructured, which, while has, underlying entrepreneurial characteristics, ultimately to create, a really robust system, there is some amount of slippage that results. So I could go on, but those 5 themes to me, like I said, they're not 100% in the green, but they asymmetrically look like they are.
Okay, so here's the problem, right? And I could sort of dissect each one of those. But for instance, on urbanization, the numbers that you use, the trouble is what you're describing are the official numbers. Now, there's a lot of strong research now to basically show that India is actually a lot more urban than the official numbers actually reveal, including data from the sky. So people looking at luminosity, looking at satellite data on built-up area, et cetera. The problem is urbanization is very strongly correlated with GDP growth and good stuff in general. The problem is for a given, so if the new numbers are right, then for a given rate of urbanization, India seems to be doing poorly.
Right.
And so therefore, that lag, the low base effect that you're basically looking for may not actually happen, right? So these are the sort of things that one worries about in each of those stories that you sort of mentioned.
I agree. I'm not saying that, as I said, I'm not saying that all of these things are straightforward. I just see more upside than downside. And I feel like there's progression. Okay, irrespective of how you measure it or whether the tracking error is high, it feels like there's progression, and it feels like that progression has some legs to it.
Okay, Sharad, you're sitting in Singapore. What's the view out of Singapore?
So I will expand on what Bunty just said. And first of all, to unlock India's potential in 1 hour and at 9 a.m. in the morning, I think it's difficult.
We can unlock anything in as little time as possible.
But let's try. So one of the things which we are looking, last election, when everybody was predicting as to what will happen in 2014, most of the channels, they got it wrong. And one of the prime reason was that all the foreign investors as well as local investors, they were looking at India, which was there basically an armchair type of an journalism that was portrayed and basically talking about as far as scenarios were concerned. India consists of 2 parts, obviously the India which is there inside the dining rooms and obviously inside the cities, which is basically 350 million population. There is whole lot of India which is sitting over there, and that is Bharat, that is 850 million people which is sitting in the rural areas. Every year, China is adding 1% of its rural people into urban force, and that is how it has been growing. The way India is going and at the pace where it is going, I think this is a long transition. But there are some green shoots which are there as far as the policy is concerned, and let me mention 3. One of the major policy which Indian government is doing is JAM, and that is Jan Dhan, Aadhaar, and the third is mobile. What does Jan Dhan means? In last 2 to 3 years, I think 300 million accounts, the people who were unbanked inside the rural areas, they were added to the financial mainstream. The number of accounts 2 years ago, which were zero balance, were 77%. It has declined to 20% now, and there is $15 billion of money which is there in deposits inside these accounts. This brings the rural population as far as economic mainstream is concerned, and that is very important. The second is Aadhaar. Do you know that India, out of 1.28 billion people, Aadhaar cards last month, I think I was reading the figure, 1.18 billion people have been issued Aadhaar cards. Now, this Aadhaar card is linked to 12 identity streams, and this type of an identification drive, I think it is unprecedented. It has never been attempted and has been completed successfully over there in India. Hardly 2 or 3% of the population probably is left in order to complete the whole drive. The third is that when you have got financial inclusion, when you have got an Aadhaar card, that is the identity, the third thing is to put them into a mobile revolution. And I believe probably 1.1 million mobile subscribers are there in India who use their particular mobile phones in order to get connected and basically get to the world. Let me give you an example as to how these 3 things are working. Last week, I was talking to a person over there inside Singapore, and he was telling me that there was a lady over there who was there inside the rural village, obviously somewhere in Varanasi, wherein she was weaving the handcrafts or the sarees, and this particular sarees she was selling almost by going on the foot to the various people, and she was earning rupees 2 lakhs per annum. That is around $3,000. Somebody, an NGO, went over there, she already had an Aadhaar card. They opened an account with her and they gave her a mobile phone. Now she doesn't have to waste time in order to market those particular products. She is putting all her time in terms of producing. They put up a delivery system whereby DHL goes, picks up those sarees or whatever the scarves she makes, and they are then sold to the customers who deposit it in her account. In 2 years, her total take home is 20 lakhs rupees. That is the 10 times of what she was earning. So the India, in case we talk, we discuss and we give lectures, that is not the way to go. These people who are there sitting in the villages, if they are there pervading all over, talking about it, people look at them, see their success and emulate it, that's how India will grow. And that is why the digitalization which Bunty just talked about, that is the way to go. The India which is there is not going to grow through the bullet trains or, say, for example, faster traffic, because that is not possible. Infrastructure is very difficult subject. But the digital highway which can be created and the mobile phones, fiber optics, as well as the telecom license which will be there, they are the ones which will create the super highway on which India has to move.
And you're not concerned about issues like privacy? I mean, there's a court case sitting in the Supreme Court which will derail a very large part of what you've just said.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a real concern.
That is true. So, Reuben, when you are touching your mobile phone on Apple, every day, the type of data or the type of biometrics you are sharing, you are giving the fingerprints, you are giving the location, and 1,000 other data points are basically gathered on a daily basis. India generally has got a very active press, and anything which is there in good stead, it's criticized so heavily that whatever we are doing on a normal life basis, that becomes very important and very critical in terms of what government is trying to do in order to help the lives. So I do agree that every time something of this sort happens, there is a court case, there is this, but these are the problems which everybody has to pay through.
I mean, the concern obviously is that the loss of privacy within a state apparatus is actually much worse than, that's the fear. And the Supreme Court may well rule against some of these.
I think Supreme Court is very active, and we have to set a parameter as to what Aadhaar card can be used for or what it cannot be used for. But in case Aadhaar card is used productively and there is a certain limitation as well as security concerns which are taken care of, I think probably the direction is right. But we will see as to how Supreme Court rules, right?
Okay. Ashu, turning to you, just macro. Give us your read on India. You've probably got a better sense of this than most people in the room.
So, I heard you opening saying that growth is slowing down. Let's look at it in the overall context. You just have 1 quarter GDP numbers, right? And it's 5.7%. Obviously, it sort of belied everybody's expectations. But think about what is it on the back of, right? It's on the back of a demonetization move, the impact of which had just started coming off, and GST. A large part of the subdued numbers are on account of both of them, because demonetization certainly impacted sales right across, and the onset of GST happening led to destocking and certainly slowdown of production, and that's reflected in the numbers. We've revised our forecast downward, but it's 7.4 down to 7%. And the 7%.
This is annual, right?
This is annual for fiscal 18. And the 7% is reflective of 3 quarters really going at 7.4%, and that's on the back of a near normal monsoon, actually normal monsoon, because up to a 10% below really doesn't create that kind of impact. Now, what does that mean? That means that your agricultural contribution to overall GDP will be much better. And we had drought 2 years ago. Last year was a little better. This year's better. And demonetization had created an impact. Now, if you think about what will happen, pent-up demand will impact almost a large part of the economy, which will show up in better GDP numbers. Whether you talk about paint, whether you talk about consumer durables, you're already seeing tractor sales improving. The second thing is around what is going to fuel consumption. And this is not just rural, right? If you look at the impact of the pay commission hike, That's going to flow through. Why did we not see it in the Q1 numbers? That's because you were just coming out of the demonetization impact, GST happened, and destocking and slowdown of production is bound to show up in numbers. The other thing, let's not forget, we are on a structurally lower inflation path.
Okay.
5 years ago, inflation was near double digits, 9.5 to 10%. You know, we're complaining that it's gone up from 1.2 to 3.7% in a couple of quarters. Just the sheer impact of that structurally lower inflation environment, the kind of productivity it releases from a capital point of view, the positive impact it has on P&L, and the cost of production has to contribute, and that's why we believe that a lot of it will show up in upside to GDP for the rest of the year and even going forward. Think about interest rates, right? With the GSEC at 6.8%, it's a darn good asset class to invest in. That too on the back of much stabler policies and a track record of not really moving away from the path. With lower interest rates, you're going to see the benefit passed on to consumers right across, and it's going to be another round of consumption-led growth in GDP. Let's just talk about what does lower interest rates translate into, right? So interest rates in the last 2 years have come off 210 basis points. The transmission of that is roughly half.
That was going to be my question. What do you do about the transmission?
And now think about what's holding back transmission. Fundamentally, two things. The fact that your small savings rates, which are really government-controlled, government-led, remain high. And we've been talking about it forever. That surely comes in the way. But for the average Indian, the moment you see interest rates hitting below 7% and deposit rates have come off, and that's what's leading to faster transmission, they start moving to mutual funds. Mm-hmm. And that's the journey of financialization of savings. Historically, more than half of India's savings went towards gold and real estate. Let's not forget, we all talk about demonetization contributing to a GDP slowdown, but the biggest structural impact it has had is moving savings into financial assets, because gold had that blip, which was really, utilizing cash at midnight because the shops were open. But real estate prices have come off, down, right? And therefore, that's going to go into mutual funds. It's going to go into direct equities. And that's how the 4% of savings into equities is going to go to 7 and 8%. And let's not forget, when you had structural better markets, which is 2005 through to 2008, the 4% had moved to 8%. So the velocity of change becomes very fast. What does that mean? That simply means better capital formation, because the multiplier on deposits is 1. The multiplier on bonds is roughly about 1.8. The multiplier of equity is 3 to 4 times. Mm-hmm. And all of that goes towards companies being able to raise capital. And the last thing, which has held back GDP growth has been strained corporate balance sheets, inability to raise capital, and certainly the state of the banking sector.
Okay, let me come in there, because anyways, I was going to ask you this as a separate question, the balance sheet problem.
Yes.
Can you, no one better than Crystal to throw light on the corporate balance sheet problem.
So corporate balance sheets remain stressed and stretched. But you know what? You're really talking about steel, construction, and commercial vehicles. You're not talking of all of India. And a good way of looking at this is what is the upgrade to downgrade ratio. So the upgrade to downgrade ratio this fiscal is tracking 1.2. Anything over 1 tells you that credit quality is improving. But you know, I don't think that's the bestest measure. Debt-weighted credit ratio is a much better measure, and that is tracking 0.8. And you know, we roughly 1 in 2 credits are rated by CRISIL, so this is as good as a full industry number. And 0.8 is a 5-year high. It used to be 0.3 2 years ago. And what has led to this change? Firming up of steel prices and commodity prices in general. And second and more importantly, on the back of that, some of the companies have been able to go and raise capital. Bond market issuance has gone up 3 times just this fiscal, which you know we're talking about roughly 5 or 6 months. And how has that happened? Simply because of lower interest rates and a lot of foreign investment coming in corporate debt, not just government securities, which I think I haven't seen in the 20 plus years that I've been in financial services. So it's the start of being able to raise capital at better rates, which will result in deleveraging of corporate balance sheets. The other thing from a banking sector point of view, with the insolvency and bankruptcy code getting passed, yes, implementation is not exactly as fast as we would like it, but steps have been taken. And steps have been taken on the back of a policy logjam that existed for nearly 2 decades. So when the elephant starts moving, it's bound to create some sound on the road, and that's the sound I think you've been alluding to. And when we talk about what's the stress looking like, surely we expect to see NPAs rise, but the rate of increase has slowed down dramatically. Okay. Last 2 years, we've seen a 3.5% addition year on year. This year, we expect to see a 1.2% addition. And the kind of haircuts, because I know that's out there, so I might as well create that one more thud of that elephant walking on the road. The estimate is about $70–80 billion, but 40% of it has been provisioned. And you don't have a small banking system in India. It's pretty large. And if you think about it, the ability for banks to provide an incremental 20% is not going to wipe out their entire capital. So the kind of recapitalization that is required is not crazy. And I'm sitting in Singapore, part of Asia. Many Asian countries, not just China, have been through it. And their NPA issue, we're talking about 9.5% was 35%, 40%, and what have you. So let's begin to look at the context of the problem and the size of the economy and the steps that are being taken.
Perfect.
So that's really the big picture context.
Okay. I'm glad to see so much optimism on the panel. So let me come to you, Vikram. Bunty mentioned, for instance, the demographic. There's 2 questions I want to ask you. Bunty mentioned the demographic dividend, right? Now, the problem with the demographic dividend is the obvious, which is that the line between dividend and nightmare is a very thin one, right? With a large young population coming online, et cetera. And we don't actually see the job creation, right? Where are the jobs going to come from? So as this 48% of people stuck in agriculture producing 12% of GDP, the surplus labor needs to move out at some point, right? What's happening? Where are the jobs coming from? That's number one, my first question to you. The second question is the question of the fiscal deficit, right? As of now, from what I understand, about 90% of what has been, we're already through 90%. And when you add the state numbers to the central numbers, you end up with a pretty ugly scene.
So morning everyone. I think I actually agree with many of the comments that my fellow panelists have made, but I'd like to balance it with some injection of concerns. And that's not because I'm not optimistic about the prospects for the country over the medium to long term. I am actually very optimistic, and that's primarily on account of two fundamental things that I feel are essential for investors or for anybody to hang their hat on, and that is political stability and macroeconomic stability. Because if you can't count on those two things, then I don't think the rest will matter. So from that perspective, I think political stability, I'm actually quite positive, given the state of affairs in India and the fact that the current government, there's a very low probability that this government will not get re-elected in 2019. So you can actually take a seven-year view from here on. And that is important from an investment perspective and in terms of long-term planning. The second point on macroeconomic stability, that is currently pretty good, I would argue, on multiple counts, whether it's inflation related, whether it's foreign exchange reserves, the currency being stable to strengthening, and at least the headline fiscal deficit being 3.5%. But that is, you can't take that for granted. And I think that we need to make sure that we're disciplined and we're watchful of how the economy develops, what kind of government policies are adopted in order to make sure that the macroeconomic balance is maintained. I do feel that this government actually is very mindful of those things. They have put through a lot of reforms in the last couple of years that will show up only with a lag, and therefore you're actually not seeing the full impact of the reforms that have been undertaken by this government, whether it's GST or bankruptcy, the digital revolution, etc., etc. All these would feed into growth over a period of time. It's too early to tell which way it's going. So for all these reasons, I think there is reason for optimism and there's reason for hope that the economy will do well over the medium to long term. The reason why I want to inject some level of concern is because India has always had the potential over the last 25 years, but we've also managed to figure out a way to under-deliver on that potential quite consistently. And so you can't take it for granted, and it's not a given that because of the set of factors that I mentioned, that we will therefore do well over the medium to long term, because we tend to come in our own way, and that has been proven repeatedly. And we have to therefore be aware of that and make sure that we take proactive steps to ensure that that actually does not happen, because I do believe, again, the next decade is a real opportunity for India. Actually, the last decade was a very significant opportunity for India that we let go, given the amount of global liquidity and the kind of capital formation that the country actually requires. We could have actually taken advantage of the global liquidity and the fact that large parts of the world were not growing and money was trying to find a home for investment and growth, that we could have actually got the country built a lot more aggressively than we did. But we figured out a way to come in the middle of all of that 4 or 5 years ago, and that actually has stalled capital formation in the country. I do not believe that the country can grow just on the back of consumption and government spending. And actually the last 2-3 years, those have been the two pillars of growth. And structurally, the question to ask is, can we consistently grow at 8% plus for a decade? What does it take for the country to consistently grow at 8% plus for a decade? And the reason why that question is important is because 5.7, 6, 6.5 doesn't cut it. I just don't believe that because that looks good in a relative sense, because the rest of the world is not growing, I don't believe that that is actually appropriate and serves the country's needs. We have a large population, we have a huge backlog of unemployment, and there are more coming into the work stream. And I just don't feel 6-7% will help the country long term. So right there you have a question in terms of what kind of reforms are required for us to grow at 8 to 9% on a consistent basis for a decade. And how do you balance that with sub-4 inflation? I'm not sure that equation works either.
Correct.
And the reason for that is we are severely supply constrained. So if you start growing at, and this was a question that was asked, and I actually made this statement 4 years ago when things were relatively better and there was still growth in the economy. Why can't the country grow at 10% plus like China grew for 15 years? And the reason for that is because you cannot grow at 10% plus with sub-5 inflation in India. If you're willing to tolerate 8, 9, 10% inflation, then yeah, I mean, you can figure out whatever growth rate you want. But if you want sub-4 inflation, if you don't fix the supply side issues and demand picks up to grow at 9%, you will not get 3% inflation.
You want to throw some light on the supply side issues?
Yeah, so supply side issues have various aspects to it. I think part of it has to do with just, do you have all the infrastructure that is required to be able to service that demand? What does it take for you to move goods from point A to point B? What kind of infrastructure growth is required in order to support a 9% demand growth? Do you have that infrastructure in place? Whether it's power, transportation, telecom, whatever it is, ports, etc., etc. The kind of investment that is required in all those areas is huge. Now, given the needs of the economy from a capital formation perspective, where is that money going to come from? That requires risk capital and debt capital. Unfortunately, over the last few years, the risk appetite surrounding some of these capital intensive areas is at an all-time low. And that is because there is a lot of unproductive capital that is still stuck in projects that have not yet seen cash flows. There are still some concerns in terms of whether the public-private partnership model is actually working effectively, whether each side of a public-private partnership is delivering on its side of the bargain, whether the private sector is comfortable with government delivering on what it's supposed to deliver on a timely basis, etc., etc. And so if you don't have risk capital or debt capital willing to participate in these areas, and I would argue that infrastructure and real estate in terms of the multiplier effect on the economy is massive, because all the other capital intensive industries, whether it's steel, cement, mining, and the real estate multiplier impact on consumer durables, furniture, just about anything is huge. And if those two sectors don't pick up and private sector investment doesn't pick up in the economy, and that has not been growing at all, in fact it stalled for the last few years, we cannot grow on the back of just consumption and government spending, and it will get into trouble in terms of fiscal deficit and in terms of the macros, if that's what you're going to count on. And even if that's what you're going to count on, you will not get to 8.5%, 9% growth. So we have to get a few more engines fired up. You have to get the private sector investment engine fired up. You have to get risk appetite back into infrastructure and real estate. You have to get the rural economy to fire up. And unless those things happen, while I'm optimistic about the medium to long term prospects for the economy, it's not a given. We have to make sure that a few things fall into place. There are a few more structural reforms that the government undertakes, and some of these risks that I've pointed out that have unfortunately happened over the last few years are actually fixed in order to make sure that risk appetite, capital, the investment engine, etc., once again gets started. And I'm sure it can happen. I mean, it's all within our control. And the problems that I'm talking about are actually all self-imposed, right?
Sure.
So if they are self-imposed problems, then I'm optimistic that you can solve it.
But so therefore the jobs question is sort of answered through these.
So I was just going to come to that point. So what I was trying to get at is that while the potential of the economy is very large, and it is true that when you sit outside India and even when you sit inside India and you look at the potential of the economy, the numbers are large and they could be very large. But somehow the absorptive capacity of the economy in terms of capital and labor has always underperformed its potential. And unless we get the absorptive capacity of the economy to a level where it needs to be, and that requires a whole host of things to fall into place, the job situation will be a problem, which is what I said. The absorptive capacity for capital and labor has to pick up, and the two are interlinked. Unless the absorptive capacity of capital picks up and the investment engine gets going, labor is going to be a problem as well, beyond the labor policy reform that needs to take place. The only other point I would make is that our country is actually a bit different from just the standard economic model if you were to follow, because there is a very large part of the economy which is still an informal economy.
Right.
And there is still a very large part of the Indian population which is very entrepreneurial and will focus more on self-employment opportunities rather than the traditional employment opportunities. And so when you
And
look
you
at
don't think that is
employment,
by necessity? I mean, there's a difference between entrepreneurship by necessity and entrepreneurship by choice.
it's a mix, I think. I think it's a mix. I do believe that we are by definition more entrepreneurial in terms of wanting to do our own thing or being self-employed. Very small businesses, but they, that's what people do. And just given the structure of the economy with the number of people that are living in semi-urban and rural areas, that by definition will also be the case. Nothing wrong with it.
I think
nothing wrong with
faith
it.
in the system, as trust in the system, as
Yeah.
inclusion into the system
Yeah.
grows, so too will you go away from by choice into, because.
Right, right. But so, because we're running out of time slowly, let me just jump over to you, Sharad. So one of the things that Vikram pointed out was, and several panelists have pointed out, is that there is growth. I mean, it's just the question of whether there's enough growth. But the other way of looking at it, again, if you want to put things in context, we've actually had 26 years of mid to high growth.
Right.
Now, historically, that's already unprecedented. I mean, there's very few countries that have had 26 years of basically untrammeled growth.
Right.
Now, if you say that you want another 10 years of 8% growth, that is 36 years of unstoppable growth, so to speak. Now, if you look at examples around the world which have actually had 40 years of growth, they're very, very few. Things can go wrong.
Right.
No, so the question now, so if you ask the private sector, for instance, I mean, most people would come around to the perspective that one of the key challenges is execution capacity.
Correct.
I mean, there is it's what I sort of think about as the gap between the intent layer, i.e. public policy, and the execution layer.
Correct.
And everything breaks down there.
Right.
How does one deal with that issue?
Right. Now, this is a very interesting question, Reuben. Thanks for that. Look at it this way. India always presents a story of extremes. So before 2014, we had total paralysis as far as policy was concerned. Nothing was coming out. And after 2014, the policies are coming out of windows, roofs, rats, everywhere, and we are just trying to cope up with the number of acronyms which are there, right? So the government has to step down. It has to execute as to what it basically says. The policies are important, but the thought through policies, that needs to be there as far as the execution is concerned. The second thing is, this government has a little of a cavalier approach. You look at GST reforms, you look at, say, for example, demonetization, you look at an IBC. I don't disagree that IBC is a good reform in terms of what it intends to do, but the way the cavalier approach goes through, let's go it, introduce it, we will see on the way. This is not the way to approach. The third thing which I will say is, I have looked at India from outside for last 15 years inside a liquid and distressed asset market. And one of the things which I have constantly heard about is that why government always talks about change in the policies when the investment has already happened. That scares us. So to give you an example, just last month, we had this policy whereby the state electricity boards were saying that we will renegotiate the power tariffs. The power tariffs are determined on the basis of a model at the time of an investment, on the basis of the inputs which are there, which go inside the project. In case you renegotiate, yes, the circumstances have changed. The wind power has become cheaper. There's basically, we have got 3 rupees 20 paise and all those type of things which are happening. But that project was not there at that particular time. So the consistency, fairness, as well as the transparency which is there inside the government policies, that is very important. So yes, Reuben, I totally agree in terms of what we intend and what we deliver by way of execution, that is a far back. I will just add one point over there as far as the employment is concerned. India, 18% of the GDP is coming out of agriculture. Yep. 50 to 55% of the workforce is engaged in agriculture. India makes a leap. It has bypassed the industrial revolution, and it is going from agricultural to industry sector as far as services are concerned on a direct basis. So in case India has to grow in terms of the transfers, the rural population, it needs to be, say for example, the direct transfer which is happening, which is Narega and everything. I think they are a burden as far as the fiscal deficit is concerned, but they need to be maintained. These people, they need to be equipped at least to buy a mobile so that they can get connected. And after that, these structural reforms need to take place through the things which I talked about.
But again, here's the problem. The problem is that it's not that services, so when you say services, you have to break it down.
Correct.
So when you break it down, you'll see that what is absorbing the surplus labor is actually construction and infrastructure, right? So then you run into a whole set of issues around construction, real estate, which is then tied to politics and campaign finance.
Right.
But we don't have the time to go in there. So let me just ask you, Bunty, a question, which is, are we looking at India in using a wrong lens, right? Which is, when we talk about reform, when we talk about all of this, we look towards Delhi, right? Now the problem is there's at least 12 states in India that are either the size of Germany or bigger. A lot of the reforms that need to happen actually need to happen at the state level. So labor laws, land laws, all of these are state issues. There's nothing Delhi can do about it. It's state level reforms. So if you are a Singaporean manufacturing firm or a Japanese manufacturing firm, should you actually care about India, or should you care more about Gujarat or Maharashtra or Tamil Nadu? What is your decision rationale there?
Well, thank you for your benevolence, Dr. Abraham, by giving me a question which I've thought about for 30 seconds and you've thought about for 30 years.
Nothing like putting you on the spot, Bunty.
Nothing like a fair fight. Okay. Okay, let me start with a slight deflection. There's this great story that's a fundamental business story.
His parallel processing.
Exactly, smoke bomb. You know, a shoemaker had saturated all the demand for shoes in his entire village and market. Yeah. So he sends his 2 best salespeople to Mars, says, go find a new market for me. They go to Mars, they run around the planet, they come back and they say, you know, you wouldn't believe it, there are billions of Martians here. One guy says, I've got bad news though, they don't wear shoes.
Yeah.
The other guy says, I've got great news, nobody on Mars owns shoes.
Yeah.
Right, so my point there is that I think that these are really high-class problems to think about, like, should we be state-focused, or should we be regionally focused, or should we be, you know, countrywide? Is it the United States of India, or is it the Confederate, you know, territories of India, or is it the Union of, you know, these are all, I would say, very, you know, theoretical questions when you're thinking about the gap between India's potential. I mean, we were joking about this before. Somebody said, what's the name of the panel? I said, I'm sure the word opportunity, potential, hope, or something like that is in it, plus India. You know, but, you know, and of course, you know, the sarcastic side would be, you know, well, hope is not a strategy. But look, let me just run through this a little bit, okay? Because I think that I'm not an expert on government reform. But, yeah, okay, retroactive taxes or changes in prices, you know, those do cause risk capital to retreat. Mm-hmm. But that's already in the price, because that's not new. What is new, though, is engaging the private sector on infrastructure, you know, thinking about smart cities, the India stack, ease of doing business. GST, I think, by the way, may have implications on ease of doing business, because suddenly, you know, it's the equivalent of like interstate commerce laws, you know, in the U.S. or the Euro experiment. Promoting FDI in 15 different sectors. That wasn't in the price 10 years ago. Financial inclusion, hundreds of millions of new bank accounts as financialization of assets we talk about. Energy reform and distribution and production, solar, right? There's so much that is changing that was not in the price. That you take somebody from an unproductive farm in an unproductive state and put them in an unproductive service job in an equally unproductive state, and you still accrete. Yep. So I think what we're talking about here is just a very, very powerful, you know, accretion impulse. And look, I think that what I like about the particular framework right now from a public sector perspective is that, you know, there's urgency and there's a sense of logic. Yeah, it's a little hurried at times, but at least in certain respects, from a regulatory and a structural perspective, we've set sail. There may be some there inevitably will be course correction, but sitting in port and talking about what the best way to get from point A to point B, is to me much less productive than actually setting sail and then at least discussing whether you should be at point B, point C, or point D, but at least getting to the new world.
I mean, so what you're effectively saying is a different version of what Deng Xiaoping said, that you cross the river by feeling for the stones.
It's not crazy, by the way. It's not crazy.
So let's talk about this whole center state thing. I'd say for the first time, we're actually seeing more devolution to
federalism.
the states, right? Because take taxes, which was a bone of contention for 2 decades. Finally, the 32% has gone to 42%. The unlocking of that value is going to be material. Yes, land and labor are state matters, but the fact that RERA got introduced and the rollout is at a state level just tells you that the needle has shifted. If you think about GST, there was no way in hell it would have been implemented if there was no cooperation, because I mean, you have 29 states. Now let's look at what some of this is going to do, and I'll just take one example. Of course, it's going to make movement of goods freer, but I want to talk about how much does a truck ply in the United States versus India, right? In the United States, it's about 500 kilometers in a day. In India, it's some 130. And a large part of it is just waiting at various checkposts. If the chances that 130 will go to 200 plus is very high now. So what does that mean, right? That will certainly translate into productivity, which will certainly show up in the numbers. And most importantly, you will find the perishability of goods coming down.
Yeah.
Because, we talk about the nation starving, but it doesn't produce less.
Yeah, it's basically it just gets wasted.
Exactly.
Right. Okay.
And none of this would have happened if the center and the state did not collaborate. And I want to just talk about
open it to the
yeah,
audience?
sure,
Yeah.
on
Only
jobs.
because, hopefully somebody will ask.
Sure.
I just want to make sure, because we are really running out of time. We'll have about 10 minutes of audience. Why don't we do it in 2 rounds? We'll take multiple questions. If you can address it to someone specific, that would be great. And please make it a question, not a statement. Yes. If you can just introduce yourself as well, that'll be great.
Sure. My name is Ochi from MC Asset Management. I have 2 questions. One is about just the legal system or legal implementation of India.
Yes.
Yeah, I understand just right now, the Modi's government is very good, and after Rajan, the current the governor is very reliable from foreigner standpoint. But the securities regulator, do you think they also change? Because I have an experience in the past that you said some of the transparency stuff, but some screwed up situation, SEBI just intervene and just
Okay. We have to move on. So second question.
So that's what do you think? And the second one is about the information, particularly for your outsourcing type of business situation. That is because of the recent development of the cloud and those kind of things. So you have any
Perfect.
comments on that?
Any more questions? Wow. There's no more questions? Okay. Great. Yeah, go ahead.
In this context, what does it mean for Indian financial markets?
Okay. So presumably the SEBI question you can take, Vikram. Just putting you on the spot.
No, that's fine. I think I'm not sure what your specific concern is, but the broader point is that I do believe that market development in the country is on the right path, and I think the new SEBI management is certainly focused on figuring out how ease of registering for investors, trying to make sure that capital markets develop in a more robust way. All that is certainly part of the agenda. As Ashu mentioned as well, or someone on the panel mentioned, the flows into domestic mutual funds have picked up quite significantly. So there's better intermediation of savings into markets. I do feel that there are a lot of new markets that will develop. I mean, the equity market by far is relatively well developed relative to anything else, but you really don't have a deep liquid corporate bond market. You don't have a credit derivatives market. The interest rate futures market still remains to be developed. Commodities market needs to be developed. So I think both the Reserve Bank as well as SEBI, and both need to be aligned, because unfortunately in our country, SEBI doesn't control everything. So some parts of the market, the Reserve Bank has a view, and therefore coordination between SEBI and RBI is exceedingly important, with the Ministry of Finance sitting in the middle to make sure that market development is on the right track. But I'm very optimistic based on the current leadership at SEBI and at RBI, and in fact even at the ministry in terms of the new bureaucracy that's there in charge of the Department of Economic Affairs, that market development will be on course.
Okay, Bunty, you want to take the question on outsourcing?
Yeah, look, this is, it's actually a very interesting question in a more like socioeconomic sense globally. 20 years from now, roughly, something like 30 to 40% of the workforce in terms of age, not necessarily in terms of skill, is going to be South Asian, right? And so forget outsourcing for a second. Let's just talk about the fact that almost every worker, or almost half of the workers on the planet, are actually just going to be located in this one particular landmass. So whether it's the cloud or whether it's any number of different technologies that allow people to be mobile without being mobile, without being physically mobile, allowing them to work in another place without necessarily being permitted to work in another place, even, if you get away from some of the nationalistic politics that are going on around the world. This is going to be a critical planetary issue. And then one that we have to think about, which goes a little bit to the financial markets, question in a loose sense. I was telling one of my colleagues the other day, these things make it less about, do I want to be in India or not? It's like, you better start thinking about India pretty seriously, because in meaningful ways, this is a country that is going to be relevant to the world. That could go one way or the other, but it's not going to be. It's going to be a compulsory, exercise at some point. And just for the on the topic of financial markets, again, if I go a little bit more into just like the micro of businesses, because maybe we're thinking in equities markets particularly, every business in the world has always and will always lose more brain cells trying to figure out how to create demand for their product, whether it's creating a new phone or a better price. One of the things that's fantastic about India is that if you're starting a business there, demand is the last thing that you have to really worry about, because there's demand for everything. I mean, I kind of, in the grand scheme of things, have everything, but if I walk into a Costco, I still figure out how to buy hundreds of dollars worth of peanut butter and mayonnaise and egg rolls. So, imagine a country where durable goods are very, very low penetration. People don't necessarily have access to all the same levels of services. Technology is still, penetrated, but at a relatively low level. I mean, there's an unbelievable amount of demand for everything. And that's got to be great for businesses that are in the middle of that.
Go ahead.
Legal regime question which you are talking about, I share your frustration. In India, when you are going for a recovery, it takes 4.25 years in order to recover a loan, and the recovery is basically limited to 20 cents as compared to, say, for example, a developed market, we are recovering 80 cents. The regime which is working, and India's potential can only be unlocked if the legal regime which is there, that comes into play and supports the policy. The IBC code which has been implemented, it has got a legislative type of an impact, and it has been well supported till now in terms of how the Supreme Courts and the High Courts have stayed away in terms of coming in the way of policy implementation. There is one particular case wherein obviously RERA versus IBC, that needs to be clarified. But if we create that type of a framework whereby we isolate a set of issues, put it over there under an independent system and ask the court to stay away from there, and the court supports that, I think the path will be easier. But it's not going to be an easy study. It's going to be that type of and difficult. There are going to be humps, and we have to live through it, and that needs to be basically reflected in the way we value the assets and the pricing which we are doing for the markets.
Any other questions? Okay. If that's the case, James Crabtree is in the room, so his presence reminds me of a question that, I know, just putting you on the spot, James. I know, you're too busy sending messages on your phone. But his presence in the room reminds me, and maybe whoever wants to take this, there's two sets of divergences that are happening in India. The first divergence is that, contrary to economic theory, which predicts convergence if you have different income levels, what is actually happening in India is actually sharp divergence, i.e. the richest states are actually getting richer and they are diverging quicker and quicker from the poorer states. So the rule of thumb that you use right now is the top 3 states are 3 times richer than the top 3 poorest states. Do you see this as a problem, right, this divergence? And equally, the question of inequality and whether there's too much going to the top and too little going to the bottom. And if the top 1% is just capturing too much of the wealth creation, crony capitalism, all of those things.
So, one, I want to say that this inequality issue and the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer is not just an India situation. You have the similar situation globally. The key question to ask is, what are policymakers doing about it? What is the corporate sector doing about it? It is very obvious that a lot of the big policy moves have been aimed at increasing financial inclusion and therefore reducing this inequality, and the results are pretty good. The fact that you had almost 300 million unbanked people coming under the banking system is phenomenal. But there's one data point that I will talk about, and that is around what has the direct benefit transfer done just in case of LPG, and what will it mean should some of the farmer subsidies start going through the DBT route. The LPG transfer has really made a very big difference, because the coverage from those who depended on coal and wood, etc., has come down by half. Yeah. And we're only talking about 2 years. If the direct benefit transfer happens, fertilizer started, if you talk about the whole farm subsidy, it will put in about 5,800 rupees into every single person covered under subsidy, which is probably something like 500 million people into their accounts. Because you have to think purchasing power theory here and not just per capita, the impact of that pulls a very large percentage of people above the poverty line. The fact that we moved from 33% poor people to 25% was not by accident, and we are tracking the 22 number, and just the 2% move will happen if the DBT on farm subsidy and food happens. So to my mind, it is a problem, but something's being done about it, which I think is good news.
Okay, with that, we should really end, because I think people are getting busy on the outside as well. Thank you very much, panelists, for a very informative session. I think the lesson we are taking away is next time we do an India panel, we do one issue. I've got at least another 10 questions sitting here. Thank you very much, and thank you to the audience.